स च मायामयो दिव्य खरयुक्त खरस्वने प्रत्यदृश्यते हेमाङ्गो रावणस्य महारथे.
A verse from the epic Ramayana, it describes the Pushpak Viman, the golden flagged chariot used by the king of Lanka, Ravan. Controlled by thought, it is said to be yoked with miraculous mules and designed to appear and disappear at the wish of its master. Later in the epic, the Viman is described as a dazzling city, which is perfectly transparent from the inside and looks like a flying disc from the outside. Since time immemorial, humanity has dreamt of soaring through the skies like a bird. Today's commercial flights, mostly involving limited legroom and cold, under-seasoned food, is far from the mythical grandeur of the Pushpak Viman. But it is nevertheless a massive achievement that human beings can fly across oceans and continents with relative ease and comfort. This is even more astounding given that it is just 118 years ago that two brothers in North Carolina were building the first viable airplane. I am Arnab, and together we shall traverse through the genius ideas and lucky missteps which allows humanity to travel across thousands of kilometers over land and water in less than a few hours. Welcome to the 4th episode of Pursuit of Prosperity, and in this episode we talk about aviation. Commercial and mass flight is a fairly recent phenomenon, but historically there have been multiple attempts by very smart people who tried to fly. First up, Shubham. Can you tell us more about these attempts?
So human beings have attempted to fly since forever. Birds were an early inspiration for flying contraptions. In the Greek legend of Icarus and Daedalus, wings made of wax and feathers carried Icarus high up into the sky and close to the sun. Closer to reality, in about 850 AD, the scholar Abbas ibn Firnas made a jump in Cordoba, Spain, while covering his body with vulture feathers and attaching 2 wings to his arms. He is supposed to have flown some distance and landed with minor injuries. There were other attempts which did not have such a pleasant ending. The Turkish linguistic scholar Al-Jawahari met his death in 1000 AD when he attempted to demonstrate flight by jumping off the roof of a mosque in Persia. And Italian Renaissance mathematician Giovanni Danti crashed into the roof of a church while attempting a public demonstration of flight in 1498. However, one of the most famous flying machines in medieval history belongs to the Italian painter Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci made his first real studies of flight in the 1480s. He produced over 35,000 words and 500 figures dealing with flying machines. Inspired by birds, most of his designs are ornithopters, which are machines which would fly by flapping its wings. He sketched multiple variants of such flying machines, each designed for a different position of the pilot. Some even had a sophisticated flight control system. However, these designs were probably never built by the designer, and that was the best outcome. While Da Vinci imagined human beings flying like a bird by using muscle power to flap the wings of the machine, the fundamental barrier was that humans have demonstrably less muscle power and endurance when compared to birds. Da Vinci's designs could never overcome the basic limitation of human physiology.
It's only natural that birds were an inspiration for historical flight attempts. But the diversity of backgrounds of the people who attempted flight is fascinating. Linguistic scholars, mathematicians, painters, everyone seemed to believe that they had the solution to the problem of human flight.
Absolutely. It seems that throughout medieval history, there are accounts of barbers, nurses, poets, locksmiths, princes, and clergymen attempting flight and ending up either dead or breaking their limbs. Everyone thought that they had a brilliant idea that would finally allow human beings to scale through the skies. The problem in most of these cases arose from the fact that a large portion of them believed that there was something in the feathers and wings of birds which allowed them to fly. This made them think that they could just replicate this with some feathers and wings stuck onto them. But as we know, this is a massive underestimation of the complexity of the phenomenon of flight.
I guess the only logical question that remains to be asked is, how does flight work?
The mechanics of flight and how birds or planes actually fly is quite complex, but the basic idea of an object moving through the air is quite simple. Allow me to paint a mental image. Imagine that you have built a paper plane and are moving it over your head while still holding it. As you move the paper airplane through the air, it encounters a force from the air which tries to oppose this motion. This force is called drag. It is the same force one encounters while swimming or while cycling. So, in order to move forward, you must provide enough force to overcome this drag. This force that you impart to the paper plane, allowing it to move forward, is thrust. The larger the thrust, the faster the paper airplane moves. However, if you stop applying the thrust, drag takes over and it comes to a halt. The interaction between drag and thrust determine whether an object is static in the air or is moving forward. But to rise above the ground, an additional force has to be applied to overcome gravity. This force, which acts in the opposite direction of gravity, is called lift. So, for an object to fly in the air, there must be enough lift to keep it from falling to the ground under the influence of gravity, and enough thrust to overcome the effects of drag. This interaction of drag, thrust, lift, and gravity determines whether an object is flying forward through the air or is falling towards the ground. The idea that flight through air was the result of this interaction was first proposed by Sir George Cayley, rightly referred to as the father of aviation.
When reduced to an interaction of four forces, flight sounds really simple. But I guess the fact that it took human beings millennia to identify the nature of flight means that it is not very intuitive. So, how did Sir George Cayley identify this and end up being referred to as the father of aviation?
Sir George was born in Yorkshire in 1773. He was very well educated in science and mechanics, and he had applied rigorous scientific method to his study of aviation. He was the first to understand and explain in engineering terms the concept of lift and thrust. One of his key contributions was that he was able to realize that the generation of thrust and lift had to be separated. Based on how birds flew, scientists before Cayley had assumed that a single system had to generate both thrust and lift, and hence most machines that were proposed for flight involved some form of flapping of wings. Sir George, on the other hand, proposed that the propulsion system would generate the thrust, whereas the structure of the wings would generate the required lift. In 1799, at the age of 26, he had designed a configuration that was essentially a form of a modern airplane with central body and wings. It had a cockpit for the pilot and a tail unit for vertical and horizontal control. Later, he built human-carrying gliders, which are regarded as the first real airplanes in history. In 1853, he and his coachman could cover a distance of 275 meters in one of his gliders to complete the first recorded flight by an adult in an aircraft. After multiple failed attempts at finding suitable source of propulsion for his aircraft, Sir George Cayley predicted that for sustainable flight, a lightweight engine was required to provide adequate thrust. This only took place in 1903, 46 years after the death of George Cayley in 1857. Sir George Cayley was pivotal in the advancement of aviation. So much so that not only did the Wright brothers acknowledge his contribution in their invention of the first powered aircraft, but Wilbur Wright would say this in 1909. About 100 years ago, an Englishman, Sir George Cayley, carried the science of flight to a point which it had never reached before, and which it scarcely reached again during the last century.
If a survey was carried out and people were asked, who invented the airplane? A majority of them would point out to two brothers from North Carolina, Orville and Wilbur Wright. This, of course, is absolutely right, but before we look at what made their attempts to build an airplane successful, let's look at the brothers themselves. So, Jishnu, who were the Wright brothers?
Before we talk about the brothers themselves, let's go all the way back to the 1630s. In the 1630s, Samuel Wright, the great-great-great-great-grandfather of the airplane inventing Wright brothers, migrated to Massachusetts from England. Through generations, the Wright family kept moving west to the point where Dan and Catherine Wright, their grandparents, settled on an 80-acre piece of land in Indiana. Wilbur and Orville Wright were two out of a group of 5 children born to Milton and Susan Wright. While Milton, their father, was a minister at the church and ultimately became a bishop and editor of the church newspaper in Dayton, Ohio, their mother Susan had considerable mechanical aptitude. As a girl, she had spent many hours with her father in his carriage shop on the family farm, learning how to use tools. Once she had her own family, she designed and built simple appliances for herself and made toys for her children. As boys, Wilbur and Orville consulted their mother whenever they needed mechanical assistance or advice. Both Wilbur and Orville Wright never completed their formal education, but they were extremely keen on gaining knowledge and supplemented their partial school education with a large amount of private study. In 1878, they had their first encounter with flight. Their father gifted them a rubber band-powered toy helicopter. It captured their imaginations and they made replicas of this machine in varying sizes. But this interest was very short-lived, and as typical young boys do, they followed other interests. However, they continued to tinker with mechanical things, and eventually this interest led them to setting up their own bicycle rental and repair store in 1893. Their experience working with bicycles would prove very valuable in the development of a successful airplane.
Given how much emphasis is placed on formal education these days, it is astounding that two people with very little formal education would go on to solve the problem of viable human flight. What followed? How did they end up building the first viable airplane?
On May 30th, 1899, Wilbur Wright wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington asking them to share whatever publications they had on the subject of aeronautics. This is probably where things really kicked off. The brothers followed the approach of Sir George Cayley and reduced the obstacles to flight into 3 categories. Firstly, the plane needed a set of lifting surfaces or wings. Second, it needed a method of balancing and controlling the aircraft. And finally, it needed a means of propulsion to move forward. Their experience with bicycles gave them the confidence that a fundamentally unstable machine, like an airplane in air currents, could be controllable. They cleared one of these hurdles in 1899 when they realized that if the wing on one side of the aircraft met the oncoming flow of air at a greater angle than the opposite wing, it would generate more lift on that side. In response, the wing would rise, causing the aircraft to bank. The pilot could manipulate the wings in this way and as a result maintain balance and turn the aircraft as well. The problem of thrust was solved when they built a simple engine using lightweight aluminium. Lacking the traditional spark plugs, carburetors or fuel pump, it was a simple motor which produced 12 horsepower, enough for the plane to make its flight. On December 14, 1903, in Kitty Hawk, a small town in North Carolina, the brothers attempted to fly their creation. They tossed a coin to see who would fly first. Wilbur won and climbed into the pilot's position. The flight was airborne for only 3.5 seconds and moved 40 feet down the launch rail before it stalled and crashed into the sand. But the power of its engine and the responsiveness of its controls made Wilbur confident about the viability of their airplane. They repaired the damage, and on December 17th, with Orville as the pilot, they made the first powered flight of 120 feet in 12 seconds. And later that same day, Wilbur would fly 852 feet in 59 seconds, conclusively demonstrating that their airplane was capable of sustained flight.
Fascinating. With this, humanity finally had a viable airplane.
Yes, Orville and Wilbur Wright had created the first viable airplane. And once the initial barrier of flight had been broken, improvements came in thick and fast. Over the next few years, the Wright brothers kept improving the plane so that it would fly in all weather conditions and could land without crashing. They later began touring Europe to show off their invention to interested clientele. Eventually, they established the Wright Company to manufacture airplanes. As word of this invention spread, others in America and Europe began building their own airplanes. In a way, the floodgates were now open. By 1910, airplanes had become quite robust. They were now being used by enthusiasts to crisscross the United States and Europe. People were flying farther and higher than ever before. As is the case with every technological invention, nations were curious about using airplanes in war. Countries were establishing aeronautical divisions for their military. Dummy bombing runs were carried out, special factories were set up to manufacture planes for the military. The 1913 Olympia Aero Exhibition in London marked the beginning of the end of aviation by the pioneers and enthusiasts. The open, kite-like airframes gradually fell out of use. All the newer aircraft had enclosed bodies with cockpits and control panels. Powered by almost 200 horsepower motors, airplane design emphasized streamlining and speed. This show also introduced a new type of aircraft, the war airplane. When World War I broke out in 1914, aircraft were extensively used to support ground troops. If seen from today's vantage point, those planes seem really weak and very flimsy. But for those who flew them then, they were an achievement to be marveled at.
Like most technological advancements, once the initial barrier is broken, the pace of progress accelerates. While people were still figuring out flight in the early 20th century, the space age was taking its first steps when in 1914, Robert H. Goddard applied for a patent on a liquid-fueled rocket. We have discussed more about Goddard's patent and humanity's ventures into space in our episode on space travel. Flight in the 1900s and the 1910s was generally limited to a single-seater. It had not yet become a mode of transport for the masses. But this was soon about to change. In 1916, a small aircraft manufacturing firm called the Pacific Aero Products Corporation was established. Their first order was to build 50 seaplanes for the US Navy. In 1917, this company would rename itself to be known as the Boeing Airplane Company, after its founder, William Edward Boeing. For most of us, the term aviation is a synonym for commercial aviation. Thousands of planes transport millions of passengers every day between places all across the world. So Nikhil, what was the first commercial aviation service and how did we get here?
So, the world's first regularly scheduled airline starts in 1914. It is established between two cities in Florida, Tampa and St. Petersburg. It offers 2 flights a day, with 1 passenger per flight. This service does not last very long, but the idea of a passenger commercial air service has now been established. By the end of the decade, and in the early 1920s, commercial flight services explode across the world. In Britain, a group called Air Transport and Travel Limited start operations between London and Paris in 1919. Their first flight carried a single passenger, a newspaper reporter who was covering the event. In the same year, 1919, Netherlands organizes a new airline, KLM, and begins service between London and Amsterdam. It first starts as a mail carrier and subsequently carries passengers. KLM is the world's oldest continuously operating airline, followed by Colombia's Avianca, which begins operations just a few months after KLM. In Germany, Deutsche Lufthansa begins services in 1926. It expands rapidly, and by the mid-1930s, Germany operates the largest commercial airliner in Europe. Across the pond in the United States, the Postal Service begins airmail operations in 1918. Western Air Express begins passenger operations in 26, and just 3 years later, the famous Pan Am Airways starts operating flights from Miami to San Juan in Puerto Rico. Post-World War II, by 1947, the International Civil Aviation Organization was created. Headquartered in Montreal, Canada, it standardizes formats for terminology, radio frequencies, emergency equipment, emergency procedures, runway markings, and airport lighting. Without these protocols, global air travel would have experienced a chaotic evolution. Subsequently, flight technology improves, and passenger airplanes become more sophisticated, safe, and comfortable. Globally, in 2019, an estimated 40 million flights take to the skies. The iconic Boeing or Airbus jet carrying hundreds of passengers flying overhead is a common sight these days.
If one were to look at passenger airplanes and their manufacturers, They would soon realize that two companies, Boeing and Airbus, dominate the entire market. Where do these companies originate and how did they establish such a duopoly?
As of 2019, Boeing and Airbus account for 90% of all aircraft sales in the world and 99% of all passenger aircraft sales. The story of how they established this is absolutely fascinating. As a flight attendant would announce before takeoff, please put on your seatbelts. First, let's talk about Boeing. It was established in 1916 as Pacific Aero Products Co. by William Boeing and George Conrad Westervelt. Their first order was for 50 seaplanes from the US Navy. During the First World War, Boeing grew into a leading supplier of military aircraft. Outside of military aircraft, it first expanded into mail carriers. Its mail carrier B-1 was so successful that it set up a sister company, Boeing Air Transport, and started to dominate the airmail market. In 1930, it launched the first all-metal body aircraft with a sleek design, the Boeing Monomail. This was a huge success, but Boeing had not entered the passenger transport market yet. In 1933, this changed. Boeing launched the B-247 with a design based on the Monomail. With this, it had entered the passenger transport market. This aircraft could seat 10 people, and Boeing claimed that it could travel from New York to LA in 20 hours with 7 stops. However, it was not all smooth sailing for Boeing. The Douglas Air Company released the DC-2 and the improved DC-3 in 1935 as competitors to the 247. The DC-3, with its higher horsepower engine, longer range, and 35 seats, wowed the market. European and American airlines started buying the DC-3 and it had a chokehold over the air travel market for a long time. In fact, in 2020, around 85 years after its launch, there were still 172 DC-3s in operation. With the end of World War II and the beginning of the jet engine era, Boeing took the market by storm. The Boeing 707 is largely regarded as the first successful airplane in this era. It marked the beginning of the 7X7 series, the number 700 being Boeing's internal code for jet planes. The 707 established Boeing as the dominant manufacturer of passenger aircraft. In 1967, Boeing launched the 737, which till date is the largest selling passenger aircraft. It included twin engines mounted under the wings and a wider body than competing aircraft, increasing passenger and cargo capability. It set the standard for narrow-bodied aircraft. Just 3 years later, Boeing would repeat this for wide-bodied aircraft with the 747. In 1997, Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas to form the world's largest aerospace company, effectively reducing the number of large aircraft manufacturers in the US to a big grand total of 1. Airbus, on the other hand, is a fairly young company. It was born in the late 1960s as a response to the American dominance of the airplane market, especially the wide-bodied variants. Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and to a smaller extent Lockheed Martin, effectively had a chokehold. European manufacturers and governments realized that they had to share the risk if they wanted to compete with these large companies. The Airbus Industry Economic Interest Group was born in December 1970, with the French and German manufacturers each owning 50%. The first aircraft Airbus produced was the wide-bodied A300, the number 300 referring to its planned seating capacity, which was then reduced to 250 following market research. Construction of the A300 was a joint European effort, and this has been the case till date. France would lead the construction of the cockpit and the central fuselage. Wings were manufactured in the UK, other fuselage sections in West Germany, flaps and spoilers in Holland, and tailplane in Spain. To differentiate itself from the competition, Airbus made it a strategic point to offer a high level of technology in all its aircraft. This included innovative construction techniques, like the use of lightweight composite materials. Although it was a success in Europe and other countries in Asia and Africa, they were unable to enter the American market. So what did they do? Airbus handed over 4 A300s to Eastern Airlines for a free 6-month trial. Under the agreement, Eastern had 6 months to use the planes. If they didn't live up to their expectations, Eastern could simply return the planes to Airbus, no questions asked and no further expense. This was a brilliant idea. Eastern ordered 23 of those planes and Airbus had a foothold in the US market. But they truly arrived as one of the largest aircraft manufacturers with their narrow-bodied competitor to the Boeing 737, the Airbus A320, which recently overtook the 737 as the aircraft with the most orders placed. In 2007, as a competitor to the 747, Airbus designed and manufactured the Airbus A380, the world's largest aircraft. Today, although Boeing is still the world's largest manufacturer of aircraft, Airbus is right behind it. Designing and building an aircraft requires a lot of technical know-how, regulatory approvals, and sheer capital. It is especially hard for newcomers to compete against these giants, given the fact that they have existing relationships with airlines and have a track record of safety and performance. This duopoly might stick around for a little while.
As time flies, we know that technology improves. In the case of modes of transport, they generally tend to become faster. Trains are faster than they were ever before. Cars can now top 300 km per hour. So Jishnu, how has the aircraft speed evolved with time?
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to burst a bubble here. Aircrafts have generally become more safer and more comfortable over the years, but they have not gotten faster. In fact, in some ways, they have regressed. The official record for the highest airspeed ever reached by an aircraft is held by a Lockheed Martin SR-71 Blackbird from the US Air Force. It touched a speed of 3529 km per hour. This record was set in 1976. It's been 45 years and we haven't gone any faster. The record for the fastest passenger plane is held by the Concorde, a turbosonic jet which operated from 1976 to 2003. It reached a speed of 2010 km per hour in 1996. The cruising speed for today's passenger flights are somewhere between 480 to 510 km per hour. There are two major problems in increasing passenger speed: fuel economy and sound. Going faster eats more fuel per mile per passenger, and this is not at all economical. A slower plane also means the plane is smaller, lighter, and hence less expensive. Secondly, flights that break the sound barrier end up causing discomfort and health issues to residents in the areas over which they fly. This made supersonic jets like the Concorde hugely unpopular. But there is still hope that supersonic flight might one day be a reality. New airplanes with designs to eliminate or reduce the sonic boom are being built. They might not be available for the general public anytime in the near future, but the ultra-wealthy might soon have a faster mode of transport.
That's quite disheartening to hear, but it makes practical sense. Spending a few extra hours in a flight seems to be a small price to pay for keeping it as affordable as possible. Consumption of lesser fuel also means that air travel is less polluting. We know that climate change is one of the biggest problems facing this generation. Reducing air travel, especially short-haul flights, are seen as one of the ways in which people can personally contribute to its solution. How do aircraft contribute to global warming? And how is flight technology evolving to combat this issue?
Like most other modes of transport on this planet, aircraft engines burn fuel, resulting in harmful emissions of gases and particulate matter. They not only emit carbon dioxide, but they also emit other greenhouse gases like nitrogen oxides and particulates like sulfates and soot. Another way by which aircrafts contribute to global warming is by producing contrails. If you've ever seen a jet flying high in the sky, you'll see a white line following its track. These white lines are called contrails or condensation trails. They are formed by water vapor which condenses in the cold and humid conditions of the high altitudes into thin line clouds. Contrails also end up contributing to global warming. All this sounds quite gloomy, but how do we combat these effects? While the simplest method to reduce air travel's impact on climate change is to just have fewer flights, in this globalized world, that simplistic idea cannot be the only solution. Countries have been trying to encourage train travel with faster and more comfortable trains. Generally, trains emit 2 to 5 times lesser carbon dioxide per passenger than a corresponding flight. Technologically, a lot of focus is being placed on making aircraft more efficient and burn better fuels. Biofuels, such as those produced from plant sources like jatropha, palm oil, algae, and others, are being explored. They have been found to lower emissions by 20 to 98% when compared to conventional jet fuel. Hydrogen-powered aircrafts are also being explored. However, this is a very expensive alternative and hence progress in this field is very, very slow. Like all other modes of transport, electric aircrafts are also seen as an alternative, but they will not be in mass use until the late 21st century.
Every solution that humanity comes up with creates its own set of new problems. Flights solve the problem of connecting faraway lands and the people inhabiting them. but it contributed to the problem of a rapidly warming Earth. But if there is one thing that we can take away from the fact that Homo sapiens, a land-based species, has now conquered the skies, is that we can achieve the impossible. Flight has improved our lives tremendously, and we can be sure that with the conscious use of air travel and rapid improvements in flight technology, we can look forward to a cleaner, greener, faster, and a more comfortable trip through the clouds. Key sources for this episode include the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, the Deutsches Museum. For an exhaustive list of sources, please visit anchor.fm/Pursuit of Prosperity. Pursuit of Prosperity is a fortnightly podcast written and produced by Shubham Vyas, Jishnu Chandar, Nikhil Nagraj, and me, Arnab Das. If you like the show, please remember to share, rate, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcasting platform.